Hi, how are you?
Hey, thank you so much for doing this on a public holiday and everything.
Oh,
Really,
of course.
really appreciate it. So, let's just jump in.
Sure.
It's okay. Okay. We are delighted to have a chance to talk with Dr. Oriana Skylar Mastro, who is a Center Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. Her work focuses on Chinese military and security policy, Asia Pacific security issues, war termination, and coercive diplomacy. Dr. Mastro is also a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Dr. Mastro, thank you so much for joining us for this interview in our Critical Issues Confronting China series. We're really delighted to have a chance to follow up with you after your recent talk at the Fairbank Center for Chinese Studies. So let's just jump right in.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Great, thank you. So let's just start with your book. Your recent book, Upstart, How China Became a Great Power, which came out last year, I guess, evaluates China's approach to competition. Can you please share the main conclusions of the book and how do your findings differ from those of other scholars and practitioners?
Yeah, so the book is arguing that in order to build power, the how China does it, China pursues an upstart approach. And the terminology upstart was inspired by the business literature looking at how new companies gain market share against established big companies. And there's three components to this upstart strategy, or the three E's. That's emulation, exploitation, and entrepreneurship. So the first one, emulation. When you ask me how is this different than other people's approaches, the conventional wisdom is that what China does is emulation. And not just China in particular, but that rising powers, generally speaking, if they want to become great powers, they should emulate exactly what the great power does because it worked for the great power. They were successful. So that's the best strategy, that competition and the desire for success breeds sameness in approaches. That's a standard political science understanding. And I think in policymaking, the same thing applies, but it would be more referred to in a derogatory way as mirror imaging, assuming that China looks and acts exactly the same way as the United States. But in my book, I lay out a number of reasons why there are real disincentives to China to emulating the United States. For one, the US rise happened in a different period of time. What was successful for the United States to become a great power, 1800s, 1900s, very different than the 2000s, 2025. China has different competitive advantages than the United States, right? So sometimes a certain strategy works great for the US, but doesn't mean it'll work for China. And a component of that is their desire to maintain Communist Party control means that some US strategies are not attractive. A very exaggerated version of this, of course, is democratization, right? China is not going to compete with the United States in democratizing the world for obvious reasons. And then another disincentive is it can be very clearly a challenge to the great power when you act exactly the way they do. And there's a lot of examples of this as well, that when China instituted their first infrastructure bank, right? Even though it was followed all international norms by any means, it's kind of like a responsible public good they provide the world. The United States didn't join, the United States freaked out, right? Because it looks like what the United States does. So there's many reasons not to emulate. So the upstart strategy says, in addition to emulation, under which there's very few conditions under which that makes sense. Basically, if they reassure the United States, that type of action, go ahead. Exploitation is when China uses the US strategy, but in new and different areas of competition. So they're doing what the United States does, but they're saying, hey, let's not compete directly with the United States. Let's do it in a geographic area, a functional area, somewhere where we don't have to compete directly, right? So in arms sales, China sells arms, but to countries that cannot buy from the United States,
Mhm.
either because they're under some sort of arms embargo or they're too poor and strategically unimportant. So the United States isn't going to gift them arms. They don't have the money to buy them. But it's sort of like this gap in competition. And then the last part of the upstart strategy is the entrepreneurial approach. This is just a whole new strategy and or in a whole new realm. And I would argue this has been the basis of China's growth and power, doing things differently than the United States. And so there are many examples of this. For example, China doesn't really do joint exercises as much as the United States. They don't train foreign militaries. But in the book, I have a data set that shows that they have trained the majority of law enforcement around the world.
Mhm.
Right? That's a very different approach than the United States. They're trying to protect overseas interests. They don't have military bases around the world. So they're trying to protect overseas interests, mainly through building a host nation capacity, and a regime-neutral approach in which they will get the support of whatever regime is in power, which is very different than the U.S. And then most recently, I also had a piece in The Economist last week to highlight some of these points. Their approach to nuclear strategy has been completely different than the United States, maintaining that minimum deterrent, which saved them a lot of money and allowed them to be competitive conventionally by spending a lot less. So, the Chinese spent less on their whole military than the United States spent just on their nuclear enterprise until the mid-2000s. And so it's really that combination of the entrepreneurial approach, the exploitation, and the emulation that I argue allowed China to build such an enormous amount of power over the past 30 years.
Can we pause for a second on, so you talked about law enforcement, for example, that they're not training people's militaries, but they're training countries' militaries, but they're training lots of countries' law enforcement. What is the sort of implication of that? And what does China get out of doing that?
So that's a great question. The book is really about the how, but I just started a couple weeks ago a separate project looking at that specific question. So building on the data set of the book of law enforcement, and then asking about the motivations for it.
Right.
And building on the motivations and then the implications, because there's a lot of different potential motivations that you see in the literature. One, which I point out, which is clear, is about protecting overseas interests. But there's other aspects that's about protecting themselves from internal dissent. So things like signing extradition treaties with other countries, that is law enforcement type of cooperation, but seems much more about being able to go against what they call economic, fugitives, those that have taken money outside of the country, either have gathered that money through corrupt reasons, or dissidents having overseas secret police stations to try to get Chinese back. So there's different aspects of the policing, and I think it's kind of just thrown out that China does it for all these reasons. But part of this new project is I've developed some hypotheses, like if it's really about protecting overseas interests, we should see more law enforcement engagement with countries that they have more investment, or that are BRI countries.
How would that work? So explain a little bit when you talk about protecting overseas interests. If you've trained the local law enforcement, then how does that help you protect your interests?
So it's about your physical infrastructure and people within that country.
Right.
So the overseas interest component is you have Chinese corporations that have physical infrastructure. You have Chinese nationals overseas, and either they're targeted, in some cases they're targeted for being Chinese. In other cases, they're just in a dangerous place, working in a dangerous place. And so there's damage to property. There's also sort of like that's a main concern of China. The United States historically has used more gunboat diplomacy, right? You mess with our people there, you mess with our stuff, we're sending in the armada. So the idea is to try to, like with Pakistan, to try to increase the local capacity to deal with it, because it's not so much a lack of will. It's that those countries, they have that instability for a reason. And so if China can help them improve their own ability to deal with it, then maybe those forces could better protect them.
And then another follow-up question about regime neutrality. What does that mean in terms of what kind of advantage that gives China? If China's not sort of saying you have to be a democracy, or you have to do this, or you have to do that, what sort of advantage does that give China in terms of influence around the world?
So I think it's really important, generally speaking, to diagnose the challenge correctly. In a lot of my critiques on understanding China and the world and U.S.-China relations, it's not like, oh, you're too dovish or you're too hawkish. It's just like you're not getting it exactly right what they're doing, right? And I think all the evidence that I can see shows that China is not trying to make the world more autocratic.
Right.
One of my favorite parts of this was like put together this data set of how does Xi Jinping react to democratic elections around the world, right? What does he say? And in every statement, it's something like, you have won the will of your people. Congratulations, best of luck. The Chinese love having agreements. Their number one trading partners are democracies, right? They want to be as close as possible to these countries. And so that sort of dichotomy, that ideological dichotomy, the Chinese are trying to avoid because they want to maintain positive relations with democracies. Now, on the other hand, though, they want to make the world safe for autocracy. And while they don't care about regime type, they very much are against democratization, which is a different issue. It's about the pressure to get China to change their own their own system internally towards a more democratic system. And that they are very strongly, very openly pushing back on. And so what advantage does this give them? Well, I think it's kind of twofold. I mean, first of all, they have much more positive relations with autocratic countries around the world. This not only gives them bilateral power, but it gives them international power, because every time the United States faces a serious issue, we have to turn to China because we don't have relations with these countries. We don't have relations with North Korea. We don't have relations with Iran. So, the Chinese are like, what are you going to give us? We'll talk to the Russians for you. What are you going to give us? So it gives them leverage. They have this insight with these countries. And even for the more democratic countries, there are a lot of emerging democracies, or in many cases, countries that care more about that economic development aspect, the domestic political system. They don't like to be lectured to, just generally speaking. And so even if they're democracies, they prefer the Chinese approach, in which they're not going to come in and be like, well, your judicial system should really do this, that, and the other. We can't build a road for you until you rethink, your training in this area or something like that. So it's also just the more like non-aligned movement, developing world type of mentality of like not like being told what to do, that China's nonchalance about some of this stuff can be pretty appealing.
And does the United States have more of that approach? In other words, we won't build that road for you unless you reform your...
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's very connected to certain things. And, you can go back and forth about it. Because on one hand, the United States, you want it to be a force of good, and maybe there's marginalized communities around the world that don't have power to protect themselves, power to promote their own interests. And so, should it be the role of the United States to try to do that? Yes. But on the other hand, I do believe a more boutique approach is necessary, because right now a lot of our policies are just these blanket policies. When it comes to things like aid, Congress determines what the USAID budget is. USAID doesn't have the flexibility to, be catering to country-specific situations. And I think at this stage in the competition, that's really what's necessary, to say, yes, of course, under most circumstances, if a country is experiencing this issue, it would make sense for us not to give them money for a road. But in this particular circumstance, it makes more sense for whatever reason. Just to have that kind of flexibility in policy, I think would be useful for the United States.
So from your book, it's clear to see that China's influence around the world is on the rise. And I remember very clearly a couple of slides that you showed in your talk where you can really see it's pretty darn clear. So I'm curious as to how you assess China's military power versus China's soft power in comparison to the United States.
So the soft power aspect, in the book, I have a number of cases in which China did try to emulate the United States, but based on my Upstart logic, it doesn't make sense for them to do so. And so it's kind of like failed strategies.
So what kinds of areas did they try?
So soft power is one.
Okay.
Soft power is one of these areas where they had no competitive advantages.
I see.
Right? Like it was not conducive to Communist Party control. Like there was no reason for them to try to outcompete the United States, not only in attractiveness of political system, but we're talking about like pop culture type of stuff. China spends 8 times more than the United States does in some areas of public diplomacy. They can put 10 times more films into film festivals than the United States, but they still never win. Most people couldn't name a Chinese brand, a couple of years ago. Probably now everyone can name Huawei or TikTok or something, but that's not soft power. That's probably the opposite.
Right.
So this is one area where it did not make sense for them to want to compete. But I mean, the unsophisticated explanation is it really hurts their feelings that people don't like them, and they just can't let it go. So Xi Jinping, they keep on doubling. They're like, okay, we'll just put more money into this. Okay, we'll just focus more.
Right.
I'm trying to make it work, but by all indications, it's not working, right? On the other hand, the military side, there are different aspects of military power. Some they've been very entrepreneurial about, and I've mentioned one about protecting overseas interests that saves them a lot of money. China doesn't involve itself in conflicts abroad. As a comparison, the war in Afghanistan, by certain budgeting estimates, cost the equivalent of 10 Belt and Road initiatives. Wow. So the Chinese position is like, that Belt and Road approach would be better than foreign military intervention. So their strategy, I think, is very clearly about using political and economic tools and not military tools outside of the region. But in the region, it is undeniable that they want to dominate militarily, not only by what they say, it's about how they behave, where their operations are, the capabilities they're building. And in that case, they did emulate certain key areas like what they call informationalization. And that's just what the United States we refer to it, most other countries refer to it as C4ISR, or command, control, computers, communication, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. It's about having space assets, about having networked, platforms. So China in the past 20 years has focused a lot. They didn't have really an architecture in space. And they built it so that they could have this, precision guided munitions, data type of approach to warfare. They also later on emulated the United States by building up more numbers of ships, to say, okay, it's good to have a lot of ships. But the rest of their structure, their force posture was very different than the United States. For one, compared to other rising powers, China delayed their military modernization much longer. So if you look at GDP ratios and between China and the United States, if you were looking at past rising powers, the Japans, the Germanys of the world, basically, China should have started their military modernization 25, 30 years earlier. Right. Mm-hmm. So they purposefully delayed that, again, to try to be more reassuring to the United States.
Right.
And the biggest sort of exploitation strategy, looking for vulnerabilities to exploit, I think there's no perfect example, more perfect example than China's what we call the A2AD strategy, or anti-access area denial.
Okay.
And that is
slow that down a second. Say that again. It's which strategy?
A2AD. So this is, the Chinese don't call it that. We call it that.
And what
it's an anti-access area denial.
Okay.
This is basically their strategy to undermine U.S. power projection to keep the United States from being able to operate in Asia.
Okay.
And they very explicitly, in the 1990s, did a series of analyses of what does the United States military need in order to project power here, and then developed a series of weapons that specifically targeted those things. So it's very clear, the United States needs an aircraft carrier. We will develop a missile designed to hit an aircraft carrier.
Okay.
The United States relies on space. We will develop anti-space capabilities so we can disrupt them in space. The United States relies on a certain amount of fixed bases in Japan for air power. They need those to project air power. We will put holes in the runways of those bases so they can't take off. So it's very deliberate, looking for those U.S. vulnerabilities in power projection and then developing specific capabilities to target them.
So I'm curious to hear you sort of put yourself in China's shoes. And you mentioned, for example, that in the region, I assume you mean in Asia, they want to dominate militarily. And I'm really curious as to your analysis of why that is. What are they looking for in Asia?
Well, on the most general level, China wants strategic space. They want to be able to do whatever they want to do without having to worry about how other countries are going to respond. That's really the joy of power.
To strategic space to do what?
Whatever it is they decide. So if they decide, what, we want these drilling rights in this area, or what, we want to resolve this Taiwan issue, or what, we want different trade rules. They want different port call rules that countries accommodate China's preferences over every other country. And what the United States does, what the military does, is deter aggression. So the U.S. military presence is designed to very explicitly constrain China's options.
Right.
We are trying to create a situation in which there are certain costs associated with certain options so that China doesn't take that. But from China's perspective, we are constraining, the tools that they could have in their toolbox. And as a great power, that's generally not preferred, right? That you have to live at the whim of another country. Now, the U.S. position, and one I agree with, is, we're trying to maintain peace and stability in Asia.
Which has been successful for the past 50 years or longer.
Right. Yeah. For 75 years, we've been able to do it. But the system that China is inheriting is not what they want, and it's not what they think is conducive to their newfound power, right? As they've become more powerful, they should get that sphere of influence. They should get more consideration from other countries, and they think it's unnatural or not organic that basically all these other countries and players do not accommodate China, because they have the United States. I mean, Taiwan is a perfect example. Taiwan, if the United States was not supporting Taiwan in any way, if we were like, Taiwan, you're on your own, Taiwan would capitulate immediately to Communist Party rule. I mean, they have no hope of defending themselves in any possible scenario. So from the Chinese perspective, they're like, well, all these countries would do what we want if you weren't here.
Pretty annoying.
Right? And we're like, well, yeah, that's kind of true, right? All the countries would have to do what China says if the United States was not there to protect them. So from the China, we think, the United States, Department of Defense, if I can sort of speak for everyone, it's like we think that is what maintains peace and stability. The Chinese mindset is still one of peace and stability, and it's peaceful because no one fights because no one has a chance. So it's still peaceful. It's just that everyone has to do what China wants all the time.
On their terms,
exactly.
As opposed to on the United States terms, right?
Exactly.
So I'm fascinated to go back to, the bigger, broader question of what China wants. And it was so interesting. You said, I scribbled down, that China is not trying to make the world more autocratic. So I want to kind of return to that because I think that's an incredibly important and, nuanced point, right? That is often lost here in the United States. But I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on what China does want. Is there a true ideological competition underway from China's point of view between China and the US? Or is China really looking for material advantages like military power, strategic resources, and economic security? I mean, what does China want? That's the big question, right?
So it's kind of like all of the above. I think generally speaking, it's in order to be able to protect yourself from coercion of others, which, deterrence is a form of coercion, but to be able to protect yourself from coercion of others, to have the freedom to do whatever you want to do, the freedom of action, you have to have all these tools of power. You have to have the military, the economic, the political. Some countries, they rely on one over the other, right? The North Koreas of the world have a lot of military power, don't have a lot of economic power. That's the difference between kind of problematic countries and great powers, right? China is a great power because they have all aspects of power. In terms of what they want, I think we think about it in a very logical and rational way, and that is partially right. And I guess most of my research does take kind of a rationalist approach of, more power is better than less power.
Yeah.
But I do think, in a non-academic sense, we discount the sort of feeling of resentment and injustice that comes from being the weaker party.
Yeah.
And how unfair it is. Even on a microcosm, I have to say, as a woman who works in defense, right, it's not surprising to me that all my male colleagues just cannot conceptualize why China is acting the way China is acting. And in my mind, when I have senior colleagues say to me, like, well, Oriana, I don't know, like, I think you should write one more book before you get promoted. And I'm thinking, there's not one man in my whole department who's written 3 books for her. Your standards are different for me because I'm a woman. You don't want to let me into the club. Like, that's not fair, but, that's the way it is, right? So I think anyone who is either a country that has been, weaker, that's been, had to make decisions at the hand of pressure from other countries, or even in a microcosmic way, if you are not the dominant power in a society, you can 100% understand the feeling of, someone telling you, well, those are just the norms or the rules of how this works. And you're like, well, it reminds me in the military when I had my first kid and I was supposed to go do a training program. And they said to me, but they didn't have any facilities for pumping. So they're like, when the majority of people in the military have your issue, we will reconsider the policy.
Oh my God.
Which is basically never, right?
Oh,
like there's never going to be
God.
a majority of women who are having kids in the military. So in your head, you're like, there's no reason for these policies. They just make my life harder as a woman. They're just trying to keep me like in my place. And so a lot of US policies, if we're honest, are like that. Like we say, the only way to spy in another country is to infiltrate spies through embassies. And like, how dare you, China, infiltrate them through news bureaus? And the Chinese are like, you randomly decided because it works better for you to do it that way. Like, why are we the evil person? We have to think outside of the box because we are in a weaker position. And so I think there is that feeling of like, just get out of my face about it, the United States. And like, who are you to lecture me when I have done so great the past couple? Am I perfect? No, but I've done great things. Like, who are you to lecture me? And so that's a very unacademic, that is not based on surveys and tons of research, but I feel like there is emotional component to this as well.
Yes. And I'm so interested to hear your views on this question of understanding the fairness issue. And having, I mean, I would call that empathy. Basically, you have empathy. You're able to put yourself in China's shoes and kind of think about, okay, what would that feel? What does that feel like to them? And I wonder if policy, if you think that policy would be better informed if there was more of that understanding of, each other's side. I mean, basically what it feels like on the US side, of course, we, the Americans, feel like, hey, we're being pushed off our chair a little bit, and that doesn't feel good. That's really scary and feels bad. But on the Chinese side, there's that question of their feeling is that it's just not fair. It's rigged against them. So, on both sides, I feel like there's not a whole lot of understanding.
It's funny you use that example because I often tell allies and partners in particular, but also Chinese counterparts sometimes, that they underestimate how much the United States needs to be reassured.
Oh, yeah, right.
That we are very nervous if, when allies and partners, especially with the election of President Trump, they were like, oh, let's wait and see what he does. I'm like, you guys, like, you have to think proactively about how to shape U.S. strategy. And part of what determines what we do and not do is obviously our own level of confidence in our position. So what can you do to reassure us? Now, of course, our Chinese counterparts are like, are you kidding? Like, you as such a powerful country, you want us to come reassure you and not the other way around. But that empathy, and I like to be clear because again, not to, overly gender things, but like there are landmines for me as a woman in my field. So be more empathetic, right? It's like that's like, so I like to be very clear that the purpose of this exercise of understanding where China is coming from is not some sort of like touchy-feely, like kumbaya, whatever. It's because if we are going to successfully achieve U.S. objectives, successfully compete, you have to understand where they're coming from. You have to understand to have good policy, even if you disagree with it. And though it's anecdotal, whenever I'm involved in these like track 1.5s with the Chinese, I am so surprised with my US colleagues about how they just can't keep it together. I mean, the Chinese, sometimes they say easy things, right? And it's like the first thing they say, like, oh, we've never been aggressive in our lives. The Americans interrupt them and they're like, that's not right. We didn't do that. And I like to just think, like, where are we trying to go with this? It's like with human rights, I had someone ask me once, how do I stick it to China on human rights? And my response was, do you want to stick it to China on human rights, or do you want them to improve their human rights record? Those are two different, very policy responses. And so the question for me is like, what do we actually want from China? And maybe to get there, you sit and you listen and you empathize, and then you're like, I'm sorry. It's like when I talk to the Chinese about Taiwan, I say to them all the time, like, I understand. I give a 45-minute lecture on why Taiwan is China's. And the Chinese are very happy about it. They love this talk I give. They're like, oh, she gets it. She gets it. And then I end the lecture by saying, you still can't have it. I'm sorry. That's not the way the world works anymore. You can't decide that because of all of these reasons, and you really believe, and the Chinese people really want it. And what about that civil war? And, that you get to decide what tens of millions of people get to do. And if this were the 18th, they're like, well, what about you, taking Texas from Mexico? And you're like, I get it, but we don't do that anymore. And so you still can't have it, so it's understanding the logic behind it, but still saying like, I'm sorry, that's not the direction we're going. Yes, I understand your lives would be easier if the United States were not in Asia, but that's not the direction we're going.
Yeah. So I'm going to let you go in a second, but just a couple of last questions. So looking at the sort of at China's weak points, what do you think are China's greatest challenges in, again, I guess putting yourself in their shoes, their greatest challenges in competing with the US? And then I want to ask the same about the US, but.
So first and foremost, whenever they make those poor strategic decisions to compete directly with the United States, soft power, internationalization of the renminbi, building aircraft carriers, it seems like it's primarily driven by ideas of prestige and self-image.
Yes.
And so if they start going that direction, I think that's a weakness for them.
Yeah.
That, when you start messing with that, so like on the military side, I always advise people in the United States, don't focus on this was bad behavior in the South China Sea, whatever. Just say to the Chinese, it's okay. We understand your military is incompetent and they're incapable of doing basic operations. The Chinese will stop immediately. I mean, the idea of that kind of embarrassment is like so much for them. So I think that's a real weakness. It makes them make poor strategic decisions when they're concerned more about image and face and prestige instead of what's going to work for them and what's not going to work for them. Obviously, the economics, I'm not an economist, but from everything you can read, the economic situation is not great. And part of the reason they've been able to compete more effectively is leveraging a lot more of their economic power. And so they haven't had to have as much, military power. And the last thing that's really going to get them, there's certain areas like the South China Sea that they can achieve their strategic goals without using force. Gray zone is going to be enough, but Taiwan, it's not. I mean, like if that's really the situation that they want that resolved, they're going to have to use force there. And it's not necessarily going to end badly for them. That's why I think it's tempting. That's why I worry that they'll do it, but it could end very badly for them.
So
the question is,
but that is something that you do worry about. You think it is?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So can they get over, people ask me all the time, they're like, oh, who cares? Like, why would China, can they get over what every country, every leader in the history of the world has gone through, which is wanting the territory? Are they going to be the first country in history that says, you know what? Like, no, I'm okay with not, having this sphere of influence in my country based on, again, what they say, how they act, what they're building, does not suggest that they are going to be the exception to this rule. But this desire for territorial control, that's going to get them in the end. That is what is going to put them really in a confrontation with the United States, potentially, that they will not be able to recover from.
And what would you say, flipping the coin, is the United States' greatest challenge in terms of competing with China?
Well, I think the economic direction of the United States, for one, our economic power is waning. Even though I focus on military issues, it would be so much more powerful if we were the number one trading partner of countries around the world. If we could rely on our trading partners to prioritize their relationship with us, such that they would stop trading with China if China used force, China would never use force. The problem is that's not the picture. The picture is a lot of countries are as reliant, if not more reliant, on China economically. So trying to get those economic relationships stronger is going to be hard in this era of more protectionist U.S. policies of tariffs and other things. I heard on the radio today that the Canadians were launching their threats of retaliation. It's like that is not a world in which the United States has the economic leadership and power. We need to minimize our reliance on military power. And then when it comes to the military power game, even though the United States is stronger in most contingencies, I mean, what we need, the way that our structure is, what we need to be a military power is just so much and costs so much more than what China needs. It's really hard to compete with that. I mean, we tell the stories of how the Soviet Union collapsed because we convinced them to overspend on stupid things to compete with us militarily. And then in the same breath, we're talking about investing more in nuclear weapons in the United States because China now, has, instead of having a tenth of the size of our arsenal, they have an eighth the size of our arsenal. And it's like, how can you not see that this is not a good idea to be overspending in these ways, right? And then just the hubris of ignoring, 90% of the world. The United States strategy has always been like, if we have, Canada, UK, Germany, Japan, and Australia, we're good, right? Depending on the issue, like maybe throw in the Saudis or something. But China is really focused. If you look in the book, I have data sets on where their leaders go and visit. It's, the presidents and leaders of China have as many overseas visits as US presidents, except they go to the poorest countries in the world, places a US president has never been. And so that kind of like, we don't really need those countries when with globalization, the way international organizations and stuff work, like you can't really be a leader of the world if you're just leading a handful. I think that's a big weakness of the United States is we just don't know how to deal with countries that are not fully developed and fully democratic.
Well, there's a lot of arrogance, I think. But let me just say that your book, Upstart, How China Became a Great Power, is absolutely brilliant. And you are even more brilliant than your book. So it's such a thrill talking to you. Thank you so much for giving us this time. And you are a realist. You take such a realist view. And it's inspiring to hear your ability to look globally and from different perspectives, like trying to, for the sake of better policy, trying to understand various perspectives. So very, very grateful for your time. We want you back again. So
of course.
thanks.
But let me just say, given that you're the China Center, one of the main takeaways from this book, all sorts of general theorists, great power theorists, they write a lot about China. And there's always a line in their books and their articles that say, this is how great powers have always acted. Why should we expect China to behave any different? Which is also saying, like, you don't actually need to know anything unique about China to know what they're going to do. Right. And so, part of my reason for writing this whole book is to provide a very rationalist explanation for why China is and will continue to behave differently than previous great powers. And to understand what they're going to do and how they're going to do it, you have to understand China. Right. And so this move away from regional expertise that we see in our country, we need more people who speak Chinese, more people who are spending time in China, not less. And, government-wise, economic-wise, we need to think more seriously about how to create those incentives so that people, and not just about China, to all the countries I was talking about before, we need people who are equally well-versed in Indonesia and Malaysia and to value those things in career progressions, in the students we admit, and in the programs we support. So I'm happy to do this for the Fairbank Center, and it was a real pleasure.
Thank you. It's great talking to you. Hope to talk to you again soon.